So our starting point for this project came during COVID-19 and the kind of bike clash that you started to see as pop-up bike lanes, low traffic neighbourhoods started to be installed, and then there was this kind of public pushback against them, the kind of accusations that they weren't being used, the accusations particularly they weren't being consulted on. Particularly in Liverpool, the picture on the right is one of the leading signatories of Liverpool's climate emergency declaration, celebrating as one of these lanes was ripped out. We were particularly taken by our project partners in John Moores had sensors on this road that said that it massively increased the modal share, and people were just saying, oh, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, as part of the pushback. So our starting point was to think about how we could kind of counter some of these kind of ideas, work to kind of overcome this idea that they weren't consulted and they weren't wanted, and to kind of mix the kind of methods of kind of sensor technology and our kind of planning techniques. I'm not going to read this out, but basically how can we integrate sensors and this kind of real world and real-time data analytics into kind of community engagement and co-design. So we picked our site in Toxteth, just to the south of Liverpool city centre. We partly did that because Sustrans, our partners, were working on a Liverpool neighbourhood scheme in there. So we left Lodge Lane, which is in the middle of the Toxteth, alone because Sustrans were doing that. And we picked the two kind of arterial roads to the kind of left and the right of it. Kingsley Road, where the number one is, you can see that's a kind of a north-south route that joins up to the Liverpool Women's Hospital. It's got a school on it, and Hartington Road to the right, it's just a residential road. We ummed and ahed about where to put them for quite a while, but that's where we ended up. Our project was, I don't know if it's the right place or the wrong place. What happened, because we ummed and ahed for so long about where to put our sensors, on Kingsley Road particularly, we were trying to think about where to put it outside the school or on a busy junction. The day we put it up, Liverpool City Council, unbeknownst to us, unbeknownst to Sustrans, announced a experimental traffic reduction order on Kingsley Road, which would turn it into a one-way route with segregated bike lanes. We didn't know anything about this, neither did Sustrans, but we suddenly were kind of put into the middle of this scheme that was with a live sensor on it. We suddenly became very popular with Liverpool City Council at that point in terms of asking if we could have our sensor data as well. So I'm just going to run through some of what we found. Some of it isn't particularly interesting. Traffic patterns were basically what you would expect on the roads. We found out that they were busy during the school run, particularly in the morning. What we found though in terms of usage is that the Hartington Road scheme, which was the one which was a residential street, basically matched the modal split for Toxteth. It almost identically matched the split of cyclists, of walkers, and then people in terms of cars and public transport. Kingsley Road, what we found is that one, it halved the experimental traffic reduction order, halved the traffic. You might expect that, making it one way, but also the bike lanes were basically doubling the cycle rates down the road. They were more or less doubling it from the background rates. We found that speed was an issue. On Kingsley Road, we found that it was something like 95% of cars broke the speed limit on Kingsley Road. It was a huge amount of vehicles broke the speed limit. It's a 20, but no one did 20, basically. On Hartington, we found that more or less people were kind of keeping to the speed limit just about, even though we did some kind of confirmatory traffic counts. There was a set of speed bumps there, and when we were stood by it, we thought that no one was meeting that, but they were. So we found that was an issue. And we had on one of our counts on Hartington, it was on a junction, so we had turning counts as well, so we could measure where people were turning. So some of it, what we found was complementary to the sensors. We found the kind of straight on traffic kind of matched. But what we found on Hartington, the kind of left-hand turn, as you're looking at that into the purple sector, is through a modal filter. So it's a modal filter unavailable to cars. And what we found is that on some days, there were actually more cars going through the modal filter than there were bikes, which was interesting. What it was showing was this modal filter that's been there, I think, since the 80s, wasn't really working. It wasn't kind of on any form of desire line, and somehow people were finding their way through. So all of that data then fed into our co-design workshops. So the idea was originally we were going to do both streets. We then picked Hartington because Liverpool City Council were doing this project on Kingsley Road. We didn't want to interfere with their consultation. We thought that was a bad idea. We picked Hartington. We wrote to every single household on Hartington Road, it's a couple of hundred, with an invitation to this code design workshop. As you might expect, not everybody engaged with that, but nonetheless, we did. Our workshops were basically a sequential discussion of some of the data that we kind of found, trying to talk through the kind of experiences of the people who lived on that street. So we started with the traffic patterns. We asked them first, before we showed them the data, what's your experience of living on the street? How do you find it when it's busy, when it's quiet, and so on? Then we kind of showed them the data. The next thing we did, using some previous research we've done, we had mapping of the 20-minute city. We used rather than 15, we did a 10-minute walk out, 10-minute walk back, to kind of show where services were within the 10-minute walk of the city. Again, we asked them, do you think you live in a 20-minute city? How does that feel for you? Then we kind of showed them the data to kind of see where they were right. Then the final thing we did, we've got one of our brilliant students who's really, really good at CGI. We made a CGI mock-up of the site where the sensor was, and we then mapped on some kind of interventions, some potential interventions from a modal filter to raised sidewalks to other kind of LTN 120 kind of compliant issues. So the resident perceptions were really interesting. One of the things they really wanted to talk to us about, more than active travel, more than cycling, was litter. They were really, really keen on the state of their road, the things that were kind of barriers to traffic moving, to people walking, to their general safety. One thing we found is their instincts on the traffic data was amazingly accurate, really, really accurate. Before we even showed them the data, they knew when it was busy. They even knew almost how many cars to the minute were kind of coming down. They were freakishly good. It's really, really good. The CGI, they didn't believe us beforehand. They thought it was too good. I let that quote there, but basically they thought the CGI was from a posh bit of town. Maybe we didn't have enough litter, perhaps, but they didn't believe us. But then afterwards, once we kind of walked them through the scheme and they kind of understood that was the road and that was the house, they really kind of put themselves in it. And one of the residents, actually their house was on that CGI, and they were genuinely going, wow, I can see how this would work, and I could see where we could park and our kids could play outside here. They kind of really bought into it, to the point where in the end they became, they were in favour of the kind of interventions. They were in favour of stuff happening outside of their street. Back on Kingsley Road, so we were working with the council all through this time. The sensor data, basically as a kind of nice side product of this project, turned the consultation around. It went from about 60-40 against in consultation meeting 1, where we weren't involved, to about 60-40 pro in favour of keeping the scheme. So as a nice bonus of this for the DecarboN8's money, congratulations, you've also helped to get an extra cycle lane in South Liverpool. But that didn't particularly change our relationship with Liverpool City Council. They were really quite nice to us when they wanted our data. Then afterwards, when we said, can we do anything else? That kind of relationship kind of carried on as it was. Core messages, the good. Sometimes it's about the simple things on the street. Sometimes it is about litter, about engaging with residents. They didn't feel particularly Liverpool City Council wanted to hear from them. The residents have got really good instincts. They really care about where they live. Sometimes that might be an obvious thing to say, but they've got good instincts. They know their street, listen to them. And the sensor data and CGI did turn heads. It did get people's attention when it was kind of presented in that kind of front-loaded way. The bad, the lead-in, basically it takes a lot of time to put a sensor in, it takes a lot of time to figure out where to put it. Sometimes it's down to the quality of a lamppost. You need what's called a commando socket, I've learned, to plug it in. If it's not there, you can't do it. And external actors can be problematic as well. We were kind of reliant on Liverpool City Council, we were reliant on Sustrans to open up networks. That's a problem, I think, when you're working on this from a university. Obviously, I think that just speaks to kind of partnership going forward. The complex, one thing we found with this is whose consultation for. This was a street of 150 houses. We found that roughly about 2,500 cars were going down that street every single day. Going back, bring that full circle to the bike lash. Some of that bike lash is identified as people who don't live in those streets, they just travel through it. So who's consultation for, particularly on residential streets? Who are you actually consulting with and why? It's a kind of, probably an existential question for councils and for local authorities, I think. That's it for me. Thank you very much.